Chapter 4. Easter. In a sense, the world is still, in a fundamental manner, immanence without clear limit, indistinct flowing of being into being. I dream of the unstable presence of waters interior to water. It is so to such an extent that the position, interior to a world, O far supreme being, distinct and limited like a thing, is first of all an impoverishment. There is without doubt, in the invention of a supreme being, a will to define a value greater than any other. But this desire to grow has as its consequence a diminution. God does not abandon Jesus except fictitiously. I wiped the blade against my jeans and walked into the bar. It was mid-afternoon, very hot and still. The bar was deserted. I ordered a whiskey. The barman looked at the blood and asked, "God?" "Yeah?" "Suppose it's time someone finished that hypocritical little punk, always bragging about his old man's power." He smiled crookedly, insinuatingly, a slight nausea shuddered through me. I replied weakly. It was kind of sick. He didn't fight back or anything, just kept trying to touch me and shit, like one of those dogs that try to fuck. "Your leg." Something in me snapped, the whinging had ground me down too low. I really hated that sanctimonious little creep. "So you snuffed him?" "Yeah, I killed him, knifed the life out of him. Once I started I got frenzied. It was an ecstasy. I never knew I could hate so much." I felt very calm, slightly lightheaded. The whiskey tasted good, vaporizing in my throat. We were silent for a few moments. The barman looked at me levelly, the edge of his eyes twitching slightly with anxiety. "There'll be trouble though, don't you think?" "I don't give a shit, the threats are all used up, I just don't give a shit." "You know what they say about his old man? Ruthless bastard they say. Cruel. I just hope I've hurt him, if he even exists. Wouldn't wanna cross him myself," he muttered. I wanted to say yeah, well that's where we differ, but the energy for it wasn't there. The fan rotated languidly, casting spidery shadows across the room. We sat in silence a little longer. The barman broke first. "So God's dead?" "If that's who he was. That fucking kid lied all the time. I just hope it's true this time." The barman worked at one of his teeth with his tongue, uneasily. "It's kind of a big crime though, isn't it? You know how it is, when one of the cops goes down and everything's dropped till they find the guy who did it. I mean, you're not just breaking a law, you're breaking law." I scraped my finger along my jeans, and suspended it over the bar, so that a thick clot of blood fell down into my whiskey, and dissolved. I smiled. "Maybe it's a big crime," I mused vaguely, "but maybe it's nothing at all." Apostrophe. "And we have killed him," writes Nietzsche. "But, destituted of community, I crave a little time with him on my own. In perfect communion I lick the dagger foamed with God's blood." This book was supposed to be finished at Easter, like God. It will take longer. God sighs, he can't get it together, time is passing, he is losing all sense for time. Crucifixion passes like an agitating dream. Nails, a little blood. None of it seems very serious. The ants insult me with this faint dribbling of pain. Am I not the creator of a hell? Christ screams on the cross, "Father, your parsimony disgusts me, is this a death?" He thinks of the abortion he missed, lying wrapped in bloody rags on the floor of a cheap hostelry. He is excited by the thought of his mother in mortal sin, and of a harsher love than he ever knew. How was it possible for her to forego the delight of hacking God's fruit from her womb? That was a chance for religion, for, behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, "Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bear, and the paps which never gave suck." Instead there was an odious comedy, this hollow melodrama of Easter. Ash slimed with pain, my exultation is unbearable. "Mother, do you still bleed?" God asks, his guts forked out into the dust, yellow and fat like insects. Mere death, always a stranger, and your idiot smile spawning monstrosity with dulled eyes. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani? There is no answer. Merely the blank violence of the sun. I am far from intolerant of Nietzsche's aristocratism. It does not seem obvious to me that someone living amongst Christians should feel disposed to democracy. It would be less demeaning if the beasts in the fields were to legislate in one's name. For this reason I consider myself at war with my society, complying with its ordinances only insofar as these convenience my dominant whim. I acknowledge none of its agents or authorities, except in the way a fox acknowledges the hunt. A state is already a sufficient object for disgust, let alone one that allies itself with the Christian religion. Not that it is a virile struggle that I wheeze, massaging my headache, but without hope. I imagine myself old, still alive, somewhat fatter, and a Christian. Sickened, I push on. I see myself kneeling, drooling pieties, longing to be saved. What could more thoroughly demonstrate my unbelief than entertaining such obscenities? There is only one sane and healthy relation to Christianity, perfect indifference. Mine is not of that kind. My detestation for the Christian faith exhausts my being, and more. I long for its God to exist in order to slake myself as violence upon him. If there are torments coming to me, I want them, all of them, God experimenting in cruelty upon me. I want no lethargy in hell, rather vigor and imagination. Oh yes, it is all very wretched, and if I am grateful to Christianity it is for one thing alone: it has taught me how to hate. God drinks upon the poison of my hate with an erotic ardor, since his ruthless erasure is even more precious to him than it is to me. After tasting deep surrender in his passion to annihilate, how could he relish a return to the sordid world of obedience, to that of his duty to exist? Nothing comes to religion later, or more abjectly than God. I have not been a theist for a single second of my life. In my first assemblies at primary school, when the theistic idiocy was first wheeled out, I remember thinking, it is natural that adults should lie to you, but is it really necessary for them to insult the intelligence quite this much? As for the longing to believe, nothing could be more alien to me, because nothing is more obvious than the fact that humanity, far from being a creation, is a disease. Why should the absence of a divinity analogical to mankind be more disturbing than the absence of a giant tortoise supporting the world on its back? If pressed, I would be forced to argue that the latter belief offers more consolation, adds greater richness to cosmology, exhibits greater intellectual sophistication. Monotheists are like those dull and uninspired children who compel you to patronize them. In the end, one has to ignore them. One cannot stoop far enough to argue. After all, if they are capable of believing such things, what are they not capable of believing? An insipid pseudo-religion in the terminal phase of its senescence is perhaps safer than the rejuvenating absurdities into which its disillusioned adherents would undoubtedly stumble. In the first moment in which I understood what I was being asked to believe, I immediately knew why I was being asked to do so. Could there be a less subtle, a more brutal way of trying to frighten people into being good? I cannot think of one, however strenuous my attempts. God the Father. What could be less challenging than a psychoanalysis of monotheism? A delusion that refuses to hide itself, to mask or complicate itself, to compromise its tedious insanity. Its critics, after scarcely beginning the task of demolition, have always caught themselves yawning. The great defense mechanism of this cult, to be too uninteresting to fight. Morality has clung to inanity with an unmatched fervor. The most hated heretics were always those who threatened to introduce thought, inquiry, or style into religion, to undermine its monotony. To be burnt by the church it sufficed to question the omnibanality of God. Sometimes I wonder what is to be involved in writing this book. I am not a particularly industrious individual. The protocols of scholarship have always confused me. It is 3:10 in the morning, and as I lean against the wall my finger runs across a line in the plaster, a fissure, dissociation. Momentarily I know one thing, alone. Bataille's most unfailing signature is spiritual disease. I dream of the damnation I have so amply earned, stolen from me by the indolence of God. Chapter 5. Dead God. Ghost in tears. O dead God. Hollow eye. Damp moustache. Single tooth. O dead God. O dead God. Me. I pursued you. With unfathomable hatred. And I would die of hatred. As a cloud is undone. I am not a philosopher but a saint, perhaps a madman. Bataille does not transmit a philosophy, but rather a delirious negative evangile. Death can be tasted. Monotheism has always preemptively reconstructed this message. You mean it can be known. Whatever else Bataille's method of meditation might be, it is also the violent contamination of Cartesianism. The title itself is compacted from Descartes' discourse on method and his metaphysical meditations, perhaps his principal texts. The reference is not incidental, since Descartes is a limit point of isolation, and in inner experience Bataille explicitly discusses him in such terms. Descartes sought to know God, and to make use of this knowledge philosophically. In this way a certain theological suppression of religion is consummated, with the philosopher sealing himself definitively within the prison of representation. Cartesian thinking understands itself ideologically in terms of a radical doubt, in reality wholly spurious, which is designed to serve it as an indisputable starting point for its intellectual productions, thus masking its neo-scholastic apologetic character. The corrosive force of doubt is to be preemptively exhausted in the initiation of the modern philosophical project, and thus mastered/ejected by constructive reason without delay. What is in truth the extreme cowardice of Cartesian doubt, its undisturbed piety, is necessitated by its immediately theological character, since from the perspective of the Church the slightest hint of radical interrogation is suspect. Such doubt merely replays the sham humility of Christian hope in the secular mode, rendering it epistemological, but maintaining its hypocritical and dogmatic character. Faith takes on the form of certainty in knowing, without ceasing to be inflexibly superstitious. The Cartesian ego in its function as indubitable foundation serves to equilibrate reason and existence, or rather, carries the inherited and uninterrogated certainty of this equilibrium forward into secular reason. This coherence of existent knowing has always been taken by philosophy to be the evident principle of ontology, or the harmonious reciprocity of knowing, being. From Plato, through the scholastics, to Descartes and beyond, thought presupposes and confirms existence, just as existence bears witness to its origin in divine ideation. Ontology can only be consummated by a being that is adequate to the highest forms of being, those that are insulated against the processes of corruption or degeneration that bring about a subsidence into non-being, so that it is finally in the divine image, which is, anyway, conveniently anthropoid, that the indestructible soul must be wrought. Only an immortal entity is able to reflectively apprehend pure being, without becoming inevitably lost in the swamp of matter, that dangerous compacted mass of being and annihilation, malignantly metamorphic, infectious, gnawed, and rotten with time. In keeping with the inherent tendency of all ontology, Descartes' ego is thus an extremity of separation, a capsule entity stripped of all relations other than those mediated by God, and moving only in strict succession from self, through the divine, to a weakly conceived alterity. It finds an immaculate relation to the profane world through representation, by means of which its being is reserved from the hazards of contact in the very exercise of knowing. It is in accord with such a doctrine that negation is purified of its raw materiality, and is thought as a function of representation, a logical operation. The denial of a thesis by and for a subject whose positivity is repeated indifferently throughout any series of intellectual affirmations or denials. It is in Descartes' philosophy that doubt is exhibited in its definitively profane sense, as despair transcended by the ego of ontological knowing. This profanation of oceanic despair, the opening of modernity in philosophy, does not subvert scholastic reasoning, but rather fulfills it, since it is the triumph of theology over religion. It is thus that in diagnosing the poverty of modern thinking Bataille is not advocating any variety of squalid historical regression, because the only characteristic of scholastic philosophy worthy of affirmation is its ineffectiveness, rooted in a servile idiocy that has proven to be remarkably tenacious. Despair is not a motif of theology, but a lacuna within it. It is neither disbelief, or doubt, both of which involve an ambivalence in the application of logical signs to an ontologically petrified thesis, but an unknowing so radical that it both escapes the scope of any possible epistemology and lacks all doctrinal intelligibility. Despair cannot be defined as a claim, hesitation, denial, or uncertainty. It is an abandonment, and a plea without conceivable destination, a desertification resulting from the catastrophic disappearance of the value of being. Despair is not humble, but hubristic, and it is not pious in the least, but tragic. In The Birth of Tragedy Nietzsche indicates that the issue at the core of the tragic is communionary. Despite the earliness of this text written at a time when Nietzsche still adhered to a Wagnerian exaltation of the nation, the sense of community at work in it is only superficially commensurable with a thought of ethnic, political, or social unity. Tragic community is not the affirmation of a collective identity, but rather the dissolution of all identifiable traits in an uncircumscribable movement of catastrophe and festival, catastrophe of the individuated self, festival of anonymous flow. Sacred communion, as opposed to mere empirical aggregation, cannot be politically restricted, since it does not proceed by means of a controllable process of assemblage, but by the blinding subsidence of autonomy. This takes the form of the sacrifice of the collectively invested individual, the tragic hero, the prince, God. Its emblem, therefore, is not the reverence of the masses, for leader, homeland, culture, race, or creed, but regicide and eruption in the streets. From the first verse of John's Gospel to Hegel's Science of Logic, and beyond, Western history traverses a thanatological plateau. Man is the animal that knows it will die, determined in its essence by a knowledge whose specific mode is an immortalizing sublimation. In the massively preponderant aggregate, the Christian religion has preached not just the contingency of death, but its impossibility. God, for instance, insofar as he is shackled to his credibility, is unable to die, despite his melodramatically vaunted omnipotence. This is an infacility that is protracted through the angels. Humans are at least permitted a ludicrous pretense at termination, Christ, God pretending to be a man pretending to die, but only the beasts are able to truly expire, perhaps because only they are left alone to do so. The death of God that Nietzsche outlines is not without a partial anticipation. If humanity's most morbid religion is initiated by an act of God, such an act is surely best described as a botched suicide attempt. It seems likely, as is so often the case, that this was a gesture, a plea for attention. The Judeo-Christian portrait of God is a classic sketch of pathological insecurity. How desperate he is to be loved. So insufficient to himself, and so alone. How sickening to live forever in this way. Unable to even dream of escaping the smell of oneself. No one hates God as much as God. No one hates anything as much. It is not difficult to imagine his excitement, attending the nihilistic ruin of his cult. The prospect of release at last. Freed of all responsibility to serve as the principle of beings. His emergent superfluity must have welled up in him with the power of sexual crisis, such that it had all suddenly not been. There are times when one's pity for God becomes overwhelming. Nothing has ever had to bear a more ignoble inexistence than he. To not exist without excuse, as Saint Anselm demonstrated, his very essence condemns him for this default. Could there be a more humiliating sinecure? When a replacement for God was sought in the years 1888-9, even Nietzsche, that maniac of compassion, was reluctant to accept the post. The madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, "I seek God. I seek God"? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. There is God. He cried, I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we plunging continuously? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continuously closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they, too, were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then, my time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering, it has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time, the light of the stars requires time, deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said to have replied nothing but, what after all are these churches now if they are not tombs and sepulchres of God? God is nowhere to be found, yet there is still so much light. Light that dazzles and maddens, crisp, ruthless light. Space echoes like an immense tomb, Yet the stars still burn. Why does the sun take so long to die? Or the moon retain such fidelity to the earth? Where is the new darkness? The greatest of all unknowings? Is death itself shy of us? The brilliance of God's non-being provokes a wave of cynical laughter. How strange that God's last act should be so entertaining. A good joke, but rather an old one now. It spawned innumerable witticisms that circulated in the marketplace, a final testament dissipated amongst the buzz of commodity exchange, but they faded fast. What was the death of God anyway? A slight fizz of exuberance in the stock market? A moderate lightening of the spirit? A relaxation? The end of a badly scripted play, greeted by the languid effervescence of cheap champagne? For a long time there have been more important things to talk about in marketplaces. The things they save the expensive champagne for. Perhaps they laugh a little at God's demise occasionally, but they are bored by it. Even his taxidermists have deserted him, the best of them at any rate. Those that remain are mostly the otherwise unemployable, the second-rate, the incompetent or unenthusiastic. So he deteriorates still, becoming more moth-eaten and absurd. If they laugh at all, it is because Yahweh has come to seem so much like a neglected teddy bear, balding, one arm hanging loose, an eye coming away. When they were children, stories about bears had frightened them. Not anymore. There was always something shoddy about this God. Lost on the way to being, and to us. Even lost, for a little while, on the way to death. A stumbler, an unwitting clown, everything he does is botched, improvised, ostentatious. His past a mix of gaucherie and tantrum. Nowhere a hint of precocity, but always retardation, leaving abundant signs of a debilitating learning difficulty wherever he makes a mark, a slow child. Even the theologians admit to his simplicity. His diminishing flock rarely ask him about scientific matters anymore, few of them dare ask themselves. He long ago dropped out of such classes, to the secret relief of his family. For a while they insisted that he had other gifts, ineffable ones, and, with the blindness of mothers, praised the aging infant's good nature, which they said had calmed down a lot. One can only smile. Maybe it is that we brought out the worst in him. For who could doubt God's fear of us? Was he not omniscient? Did he not always see the rusty dagger in our hands? And we were created in his image. The corporealization of his hatred for himself, what tatters of self-love remained to him, came apart at this sight. To reign over all things, as the archetype of man. A piteous enough truth to exhibit. Few things approximate so closely to infinity as the humorous incommensurability between man and the sum of the universe. To span such a gulf within oneself is to live in idiocy. To be not only an animal, but a depraved one, an aborted animal, a sick animal, a delirious animal. Upon first seeing a rabid dog one thinks it is becoming human. This is not a promising basis for divinity. If he hid from us, it was only in attempting to hide his eyes, to block us out. Yet amongst the accidents of his omniscience, or of his inexistence, was included the absence of eyelids. We burnt on his sleep-starved retina like harsh stars. Our deicide crawled like a rash upon his skin. He could only stare at us, and our history ensued, a convulsion of lethal horror. Of course, he made innumerable attempts at emigration, but who would have him? Who wants a second-hand God? Philosophy provided only a temporary refuge, rebelling eventually against his bad manners. How nostalgic he was of his days as a carpenter, once he had become a tramp. It is tempting to dredge into our lassitude, seeking another end for God. Might he not have been allowed to retire? The state would surely have granted him a modest pension. Does not Kant provide the basis for such a policy? After all, few would dispute that senile tyrants make wretched victims. It seems scarcely more dignified to kill God than to slaughter a dog when it becomes too old to work. Who, then, is still capable of Nietzsche's generosity? It is rare to find one who takes much pride in slaughtering God these days. More common is a vague feeling of impurity. One has soiled oneself by bothering with something so vile and corrupt. That God was ever permitted residence amongst us is a source of embarrassment, or, at best, of uneasy humor. It is understandable that many should feel vaguely bad about God. Was he not a little too vulnerable, old, and pitiful to kill? Should we not greet his inexistence with an impatient of course, and turn to more serious things? Do we really lack the delicacy to let God die quietly, on his own, like a dog? It is true that we probably merited a better God to sacrifice. it is not unreasonable to imagine that a cosmos that spawned a Heraclitus deserved a more dignified ruler than the grumpy old ape of Occidental monotheism. Nevertheless, it is pointless nursing such regrets. They belong to the mournful might-have-beens of our history, decided long before we had a chance to shop around for a god. Bataille ends an early article entitled Propositions with the words, "The true universality is the death of God." He is insistent, throughout the entire sweep of his work, that the death of God, as announced in Nietzsche's The Gay Science, is to be thought of as a religious event, indeed, as the positive end of religion, as zero. For Bataille, far more than for Nietzsche, the atheology thus engendered is of a specifically Christian character, in that it is rooted in the sense of the crucifixion. Bataille reads the world historical power of Christianity through its quasi-latent content of an absolute sacrifice, that of God himself, which has created a religion of divine suicide. At the same time he considers Christianity to have deformed and obscured this thought, burying it under a theology of redemption. In the development of monotheistic belief, man tends to substitute for the evident prodigality of the heavens the avidity which constitutes him. It is thus that little by little he effaces the image of celestial reality without sense or pretension and replaces it with a personification, of an anthropomorphic nature, of the immutable idea of good. The subordination of the sacred category of death to the rational category of immorality, bedrock value, is a profanation of religion. The transformation of sacrifice into utility, exchange, and negotiation. A god unable to expend itself utterly is a figure of servility and abjection, bound to persistence with iron chains. God, the transcendent guarantee of being, the service of God, abasement before this principle, that being persist, be imperishable. Bataille insists that Nietzsche's thought of the death of God is sacrificial, orgiastic, and festive. Christian belief must pass over not into a complacent scientistic utilitarianism, but into the ecstasies of uninhibited wastage. The loss of God is the loss of self, the definitive shattering of the anthropic image, so that the bedrock ego of servile humanity is dissolved into the solar energy flow. Bataille is not remotely interested in being saved, he wants only to touch the extreme, writing that I have wanted and found ecstasy, an ecstasy that is the experienced loss of being. This is not a matter of dying, but of surviving, momentarily, only through excess, as chance, without guarantees, and without inhibiting the dissipative tide. Being is given to us in an intolerable surpassing of being, no less intolerable than death. And because, in death, this is withdrawn from us at the same time it is given, we must search for it in the feeling of death, in those intolerable moments where it seems that we are dying, because the being in us is only the through excess, when the plenitude of horror and that of joy coincide. God has only one possible meaning, phallus. The God of the ontological argument is omniphallus, in whom reason, being, authority, and the good coincide. It belongs to the essence of a perfect being that he exist forever. Who could deny that the crucified was well hung? But perhaps one should not laugh about such things, for even if God is a comic, one's Willy, and its mythology, has surely to be taken seriously. As for Yahweh's immense throbbing member, that is a matter of the gravest consequence. Through it he establishes himself as the supreme transcendent object, eternally postponing the black spasm whose result is detumescence and the end of the universe. Were God to ever sacrifice his erection for a taste of death, the principle of identity would dissipate into scorched dust, and being would relapse into the dark. Phallus, as psychoanalysis has always said, is the same as castration. To be an immortal organ of intimidation is to abstain forever from the movement twisted through oblivion and relapse. In the solar anus Bataille remarks, those in whom the force of eruption is accumulated are necessarily situated below. What God must never succumb to is the molten penis of terrestrial coupling, for which logic, of castration, has lost its sense, because nothing remains to separate it from vulvic dissolution. In the final spasm of sexual anguish God bites off his penis and with his more dripping blood, mules like a dying hyena into the void. "Would you like to see my rags?" she said. With both hands gripping the table, I turned towards her. Seated, she lifted a leg high, in order better to open the slit, she drew apart the skin with both hands. Thus the rags of Edward gazed at me, hairy and pink, full of life like a repugnant octopus. I stammered softly. "Why do you do that?" "You see," she said, "I am God." The narrator of Madame Edward proceeds to kiss the whore's rags as the Christian mystics kiss the wounds of Christ. There can be little doubt that Bataille imagines the vulva as a wound, but this is not because of a negative relation to castration. Far from being an excised penis, the vulva is a complex terrain of contact with death, of exactly the kind castration prescribes. Nor can the flowing wound that breaks open being into communication be one pole of a sexual relation, matched by a plenitude, since this vulvic opening would be sexuality itself, except there is no such thing as sexuality itself. The ancient Romans are only the most famous example of the arithmetical gratuitousness of zero. When zero is absent it is not missed, no one notices the default of default. Nevertheless, counting systems enriched by zero, and the place order associated with it, are of massively enhanced sophistication over those in which nothing is missing. Introducing nothing makes an inestimable difference. Zero is indivisible, so that zero belief cannot be rigorously differentiated from belief in zero. It is in this sense that atheism is a religion. Not that atheism is committed to a specific conviction, quite the opposite, it is precisely the specificity of conviction that it attacks. Understood negatively it denies the false absolute of theos, but understood positively it affirms the true absolute marked by the privative A, the Nile from which creation proceeds, the undifferentiable cosmic zero. When the valet touched the slit he groaned, "In the name of God. I drink in your ending. And I spread your naked legs. I open them like a book, where I read that which kills me. I am God. I knock on your head. Hair priest. I kill you. I am a cunt." Everything has obviously gone wrong for us in order for Plato to begin with 1 rather than 0. To take 1 as originary is to presuppose everything, such as unity, individuation, achieved form, and dogmatic plenitude. The 1 is the phallomorphic base of Occidental culture, in the sense that Irigaray understands it. It is the mono of monotheism, and monotheism is condensed irreligion, the definitive patriarchal effacing of intrauterine indifferentiation, and thus of the primary ripple from out of chaotic zero. The differentiated 1 is the Father, and his adorers understand nothing of religion. Even in writing the nothing, as Aquinas does, they eclipse it with absolute ego, him. Nor is it the case that primary immanence is merely crushed with arbitrariness beneath a partially inadequate metaphorics, since, far from being neutral between the sexes, it is precisely because indifferentiation, equals 0, is sexually unsegmented that it is even more feminine than the mother. The femininity of 0 is uncompromised by its indifference, due to the unilateral character of individualizing deviation. Whilst 0 is certainly alien to the Father, there is no differentiation from 0. Indeed, 0 is so utterly vulvo-uterine that patriarchy is synonymous with irreligion, faith. Between barter systems and money systems there is a difference strictly analogous to that between Roman arithmetics and the place value system from India, transmitted by the Arabs to the West. Like 0, money is a redundant operator, adding nothing in order to make things hum. When Marx associates capital with death he is only drawing the final consequence from this correspondence. Surplus value comes out of labor power, but surplus production comes out of nothing. This is why capital production is the consummating phase of nihilism, the liquidation of theological irreligion, the twilight of the idols. Modernity is virtual thanocracy guided insidiously by 0, the epoch of the death of God. There is no God but, only, 0, indifferentiation without unity, and nihil is true religion. Schopenhauer remarks of the cosmic vulva, equals 0. We must not even evade it, as the Indians do, by myths and meaningless words, such as reabsorption in Brahman, or the nirvana of the Buddhists. On the contrary, we freely acknowledge that what remains after the complete abolition of the will is, for all who are still full of the will, assuredly nothing. But also conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and denied itself, this very real world with all its suns and galaxies, is nothing. Chapter 6. The Rage of Jealous Time. For thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God. 14. Ye shall not go after other gods, of the gods of the people which are round about you. 15. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from off the face of the earth. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen. God is jealous, and the Lord revengeth, and is furious, the Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserveth wrath for his enemies. Amongst the many partial anticipations of the modern thought of the transcendental in antiquity is the jealousy of Yahweh. extricated from its childish psychological constriction, its commensuration to a personal being. This is one of the few religious thoughts to be found in the history of stern monotheism. To refuse to share, to coexist, to tolerate equivalence, these things are ruthlessly divine. In comparison to Yahweh, the God of the Christians is a wheedler, a door-to-door salesman. It is true, nevertheless, that the genocidal frenzy with which Yahweh asserts his monopoly can disconcert. Squeamishness is not a charge one can fairly bring against him. 1. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. 2. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them, and utterly destroy them, thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. 3. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them, thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. 16. But of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth. 17. But thou shalt utterly destroy them, namely the Hittites, and the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee. Jealousy is inextricable from paroxystic violence, historically rooted in national chauvinism, before being sublimed into the cosmological intolerance of a divinity. What does it matter who is instrument here? Whether God serves the annihilating designs of a tribe, or the tribe serves to purify the earth of alien gods. There is no antagonism at the origin, but rather a perfect pact between the election of the chosen people and the brutal solitude of the unnameable one. What the Jews never understood about this God, the Christians understood it even less of course, was the sovereignty of this jealous wrath. How could these feverish rages be subordinated to an end beyond themselves, to a mere persistence, as if God, too, was subject to inhibition? A God that held himself in check, submitting the splenetic extravagance of his moods to the exigency of being, would be something far less glorious than the sun. He would be humbled by a mediocre star. Each creature uselessly dispensing with its existence would outstrip his prodigality, deepening by a wretched notch his hatred for himself. Could such a God, glimpsing the impossible sovereignty of his fury, time opening as a dark shaft of impersonal loss, and, howling in utter loathing at the servility of self, restrain from scurrying to a squalid death on the cross? God savors himself, says Eckhart. This is possible, but what he savors is, it seems to me, the hatred which he has for himself, to which none, here on earth, can be compared. I could say, this hatred is time, but that bothers me. Why should I say time? I feel this hatred when I cry, I analyze nothing. Why should anyone be interested in time? I cannot imagine. The scrawniness of an arm, a finger, the enigma of a face, these things make sense, hurt. Time, on the contrary, is as vacant as a marriage, or God alone in the dark. At the moment I seize myself in the mire of being, swamped by the detestation of ulterior ends, I am God, and time laughs at the eternal pretension of slaves. This God who leads us beneath his clouds is mad. I know him, I am him. But ill recommends that one chant, I represent myself covered in blood, broken but transfigured and at one with the world, at once like prey and like a tooth of time which kills incessantly and is incessantly killed. Jealousy is as inextricable from a movement of abolition as it is essential to the being of God. Time cannot be limited to a property or attribute of divinity, for this would make jealousy posterior to a preliminary legislation of essence. It would, in any case, be impossible for God to resent the absolute wilderness of time, since his hatred must pander to the flow of erasure. Perhaps it is that God mistakes himself for time, until he sees things die without reluctance, and turns upon himself in unfathomable desperation. I am that I am is already a preemptive affix of incinerating privilege, or it is nothing. In the beginning was the rage, or is it that we imagine God being disappointed by his creation? A surprised God? A bewildered God? His great work gone astray? This is the psychological divinity, taken aback by naughty children, the offended God that we tell our 5-year-olds about. A God without wrath, but only righteous anger. A magistrate. What could such a being fail to botch? But jealousy is not indignation, and at the moment of unfettered rage, when God no longer serves anything, and the molten edge of his wrath delects in the submission of being to sovereign whim, then authority no longer belongs to God but to time. But Hill writes of the catastrophe of time because security cannot establish itself, because time is jealous of being. It is in his early essay Sacrifices, 1936, that he first develops this thought to its rigorous conclusion in Incompletion and Collapse. No ontology of time is possible, and yet ontology remains the sole foundation for discursive accomplishment. There are only the shattered spars and parodies of philosophy, as ruinous time pounds thought into the embers of an unwitting sacrifice, breathed in a laughter as cold and nakedly joyous as the void. Time is not the synthesis of being and of nothing if being or nothing do not find themselves except in time and are nothing but arbitrarily separated notions. There is not then in effect either being or nothing in isolation, there is time. The existence of things is not able to enclose the death which this existence brings, but is itself projected into the death that encloses it. Time is the suicidal jealousy of God, to which each being, even the highest, must fall victim. It is thus the ultimate ocean of immanence, from which nothing can separate itself, and in which everything loses itself irremediably. The black mass of jealous rage swells like a cancer at the core of the universe, or like a volcanic ulceration in the guts of God, and its catastrophic eruption consumes all established things in the acidic lava of impersonality. We say time, and become philosophical, to describe jealousy purifying itself of God. But with God purity collapses also. Perhaps there is still passion in God, but it is passion as the dog is the dog when the dog is on a leash. There is no possibility for the passion of God to unchain itself, since God is reason. Perhaps the experience of the mystics is in accord with me, because it shows that from the sacred one must leave a place for an unchaining which receives no limits, since, from the sacred, it is necessary to break every species of boundary, to no longer consider limits either of reason or morality as possible. But, once again, at this moment, is it not evident that God dies? That jealous time erases all things is in no sense the acknowledgement of a dematerialization, since the only place to escape from matter was God. The thought that matter is not a content of time is perhaps the preeminent shadow of a truth that is at once an impossibility and an abomination, also an ecstasy. As the shockwave of jealousy ejects the universe's lactescent debris from the crater of reason, transcendent matter loses the perfection of its inertia, design, and nature implodes into the spasms of its own laceration. As the destroyer of the universe is time, and as the destroyed nature, but in the destruction nature sloughs off the crust in which it had petrified itself and infests time like rot, regressing to its molten core, base matter, becoming, flow, energy, immanence, continuity, flame, desire, death. Ecstatic time is not able to find itself except in the vision of things that puerile hazard makes brusquely appear, cadavers, nudities, explosions, spilt blood, abysses, bursts of sun and of thunder. There is every reason to resist such insanity. Reason is nothing else. Nothing could be more evidently intelligible than the fact that no enterprise has cost a sum of labor greater than that which sought to arrest the flow of time. Civilization is the name we give to this process, a process turned against the total social calamity, the cosmic sickness, inherent to process as such. If the deluge, which is danger in itself, is the final motor of history, it is the great civilizations which are the engines or composite machines, channeling flows and engendering the mirage of function. As with an ant's nest, what emerges in the aggregate is a frenetic immobilism, a literal robotism, converting process into work, and work into the further embalming of process. Everything is set against the explosive immensity of time. Insofar as a civilization functions, therefore, it becomes increasingly sclerotic and pyramidalized, rituals, customs, codes, all hardened against the release of unendurable forces that would follow from the meltdown of the energy source, which is pushed further and further upstream, purified. The long period stretching from the ancient empire of Egypt to the bourgeois monarchy of Orleans, which elevates the obelisk in the square to the applause of an immense populace, has been necessary to man in order to achieve the setting of the most stable limits to the deleterious movement of time. The mocking universe being slowly delivered to the severe admirer of its all-powerful Father, guarantee of deep stability. The slow and obscure movements of history have their place here at the heart and not the periphery of beings, and it is the long and inexpiable struggle of God against time that they figure, it is the combat of established sovereignty against the shattering and creative madness of things. Thus history endlessly resumes the response of the immovable stone to the Heraclitean world of flows and flames. This is a movement of synchronization, distilling out an absolute time to provide a form for history without impingement, extrinsically compiling events into manipulable series. Every civilization aspires to a transcendent eon in which to deposit the functional apparatus of chronos without fear of decay. What is dammed up in the eon is the densely material time of rupture and ruthless recreation, whilst what remains to anemic chronology is time as the medium of homogeneous, commensurable, and reproducible processes, a domesticated temporality adjusted to work, from which catastrophe has been abstracted out through sublimation into the infinite. Synchronization is founded upon an immense and precarious stabilization, the petrification of a pure and absolute time, or the completion of time as such, the timeless essence of time. Synchronization has as its basic presupposition the eon as final register of events, as the perfectly immaculate scroll upon which creation's middle dot unfolding is inscribed, and it is because of this that it corresponds to the servility of God, to his proper function and cosmic duty as bookkeeper of the universe. In other words, synchronization has as its condition of possibility the imperative rationality of the divine. Nietzsche tells us that, even after it has occurred, it takes a long time for the death of God to arrive, but that does not mean it is delayed, rather, it unleashes the asynchronicity whose ultimate repression God was. To be too early, unsichtgemäß, is not at all to wait. It is to suffer the eruption of real time. Neither is death the arbitrary content of asynchronicity, a subject predicated by it. Death is not extrinsically, but inherently, asynchronous. 12. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. 13. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. 14. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. 15. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. But the fearful, and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. It seems that something is in fact annihilated. The end and the beginning correspond. At the beginning was God alone. Therefore things will be brought to a point where there is again nothing but God alone. Thus all creatures will be annihilated. Voice of Aquinas' heretical interlocutor. No text has programmed the thought of death in the Western tradition more fundamentally than chapters 20 and 21 of Revelation, where its historically dominant topic is established, namely, the second death, or terminal fate of the soul. Augustine's Surrey of God, written between AD 413 and 427, established the orthodox interpretation of these passages. The second death is first mentioned in Book 13 Chapter 2, but the decisive text is Chapter 12 of the same book, where he remarks, the first death consists of two, the death of the soul and the death of the body, so that the first death is the death of the whole person, when the soul is without God and without a body, and undergoes punishment for a time. The second death, on the other hand, is when the soul is without God, but undergoes punishment with the body. He concludes this brief discussion with the words, the last or second death, which has no other death to follow it. The second death is thus aligned rigorously with eternal damnation, which is in turn conceived on the basis of the language found in Revelation and elsewhere, the infernal terminology that has provided the West with its imagery of ultimate torment for 2 millennia. To die the second time is to burn forever, suspended without cessation in the flames of hell. This infinitely protracted combustion process transcends the terrestrial arbitrariness of the first death, constituting a limit to the operation of the negative, an unsurpassable incendiary horizon. As is always the case with Augustine, his account is characterized by its vulgarity, gracelessness, and complete destitution of intelligence. This offish crudity was to provide a crucial model for later Christian discourses on the subject, and captures very well the essentially brutal nature of the faith, which even the more spirited Christian writers would continue to propagate in the mode of traditional authority. Thus it is that Thomas Aquinas, who demonstrates intellectual and literary powers immeasurably outstripping those of Augustine, places those powers in the service of the Augustinian dogmas, typifying the most noble pattern of orthodox Christian culture, that of sophisticating and inherited spiritual loutishness. It is Aquinas' stupendous Summa Theologiae, an intellectual cathedral that is perhaps the greatest single achievement of Christian civilization, that but ill parodies in his own Summa Theologique. Everything that one sees is the parody of another, or perhaps the same thing in a deceptive form, as he remarks in the Solar Anus. It is Aquinas' meticulous construction of the inherited faith in this work that provides the first solid cultural foundations for the exercise of Christian authority, a function analogous to that of Kant in our own age, in which epistemology or regulated skepticism comes to replace theology under the impetus of a massive infrastructural transformation of socio-historical production processes. Aquinas began writing the Summa in 1265, when he was 40 years old, and continued it, with intermittent interruptions, until his death in 1273. Far more than the messy, wildly inconsistent, and arbitrarily compiled text we know as the Bible, it is the Summa that provides a doctrinal basis for hegemonic Christianity, and the return to primary scripture associated above all with Luther, marks the beginning of an inexorable degeneration process. The central accomplishment of the Summa is that of establishing a rational basis for the Augustinian rantings that had become embedded in the faith, and prominent amongst these is the conception of the second death as eternal torment, bound to the doctrine of the soul's natural immortality, the deepest wellspring of Christian ressentiment. The heart of Aquinas' argumentation on this matter is found in the 4 articles of Question 104, which is arguably the most important text in the entire sweep of scholastic philosophy. The position Aquinas inherited from Augustine can scarcely be described as philosophical. It is at most an attempt to construct some semblance of doctrinal consistency on the basis of conscientious but talentless scriptural exegesis conducted in the context of an anti-pagan polemic that aspires to persecutory authority. Not that this in any way compromises Augustine's claim to be exemplary of Judeo-Christian piety, on the contrary, his rabid intolerance responds perfectly to the dominant tone of monotheistic belief. Nevertheless, one can only sympathize with Aquinas, trying to argue for the rationality of the faith, whilst behind him reverberate deranged barkings such as this. But in that last condemnation, although a man does not cease to feel, his feeling is not that of pleasure and delight, nor that of health and tranquility. What he feels is the anguish of punishment, and so his condition is rightly called death rather than life. The second death is so called because it follows the first, in which there is a separation of natures which cohere together, either God and the soul, or the soul and the body. It can therefore be said of the first death that it is good for the good, bad for the bad, but the second death does not happen to any of the good, and without doubt it is not good for anyone. Aquinas' extraordinarily intricate task was to reconstruct the Christian doctrine of death on orthodox grounds, but this time rational ones, without succumbing to the humanistic impiety latent in the notion of the soul's natural immortality. Both Irenaeus and Arnobius had challenged this doctrine, considering it incompatible with the absolute dependence of all created things upon God, and even Augustine himself seems at times to undermine it. Once the natural immortality of the soul is questioned, however, it is but a short step to the thought that the unreformably wicked might be simply extinguished, after an appropriate period of rigorous punishment, rather than eternally tortured, a doctrine that Irenaeus seems to have held, and Arnobius certainly did. This is the extreme heresy of annihilationism, later to be associated with the Socinians, who were vigorously persecuted for it, and other Arians. It was considered so heinous a belief throughout the hegemonic period of Christian domination that professing it was literally suicidal, since it merited a reaction on the scale of atheism itself, torture and death, both first and second, although atheists were no doubt more concerned about the first. D.P. Walker, in his discussion of 17th and 18th century annihilationism, remarks that atheists and Socinians, who were supposed to believe in the annihilation of the wicked, were generally considered outside the bounds of even the broadest religious tolerance, since they were socially dangerous. It was the business of the state to eliminate them. It is thus a mark of considerable integrity that Aquinas, some 400 years earlier, insists upon their limited plausibility of the annihilationist case. He divides his argument into stages, first affirming God's power to annihilate, and only then denying that this power is in fact exercised by a benevolent being, eternal damnation as the sentimentality of God. He concedes, in the first stage of this argument, just as before things existed God had the power of not giving them existence, and thus of not creating, so also once they are created he has the power of not continuing to uphold them in existence, they would then cease to be. That is annihilation, quodistes in nihilum redigia. Annihilation or, more precisely, the return to nothing, is related to two interconnected concepts of decisive importance to scholastic theology, those of creation and conservation. The Nile of Annihilation is the nothing from which creation brings forth the being, since what is created comes out of nothing, ex nihilo. Creation both draws the being out of nothing, and holds it out of nothing, or conserves it. The perpetual conservation of the being is a positive and incessant causation that relates it immediately to God, so that were God to annihilate, it would not be through some action, but through cessation from action. Annihilation is thus a release from action, a relapse that has a merely negative relation to God. It is the being's own tendency that leads it to annihilation, as soon as God ceases to interfere in the creature's relation with absolute death, which is alien to God, since his relation to nothingness is purely inhibitive. In one sense the being of the creature communes with God as its cause, but as a difference from the Nile attention of the creature relates only to death, and God's participation is that of a third party incidentally impinging upon a communication that escapes him. God and the Nile squabble over creation as jealous rivals fight over a shared lover, except that the creature, however much it might respect God, is torn by its desire in quite the other direction, whilst the Nile has all the tantalizing indifference that naturally flows from incomparable powers of seduction. The heresy of annihilationism, by ridding itself of the distracting circus of damnation, clarifies the fundamental impetus of Judeo-Christian monotheism as no other doctrine can. This God is the antagonist of zero, and therefore the fortress of identity, personality, individuation. To be exiled definitively from such a God, to lose his protection, is to relapse into indivisible non-being, decreated into the Nile. That annihilationism has failed to have a significant influence upon Christian orthodoxy attests in part to the tenacious privilege that folk religion and superstition have always maintained over intellectual consistency within the churches, but more importantly, it indicates the voluptuary and disciplinary investment in the thought of the eternal torment of the wicked, exemplified by Augustine. For the pious annihilationist, the perpetuation of existence beyond death is conceived as a reward, reserved only for the deserving, more precisely, the good. More profound than the vulgar empiricity of torment, it is non-being that is the true punishment. The souls of the wicked are subject to the undifferentiable pole of an absolute judgment, simple extinction. For those who remain stubbornly unenticed by the prospect of the long post-necroid haul under God, there is thus a surgical and non-penitentiary alternative. Like all blocks of reactive libido, annihilationist Christianity map to displaced active impulse within itself. Utter dissolution is offered as a lure, but safely imprisoned in a system of ethicological exclusion processes, permeable only to that inarticulate ardor which springs from the repressed materiality of the human animal. The taint of evil, or of divine, paternal, disapproval, serves as one barrier screening the ego from the non-image of death. Even more important, because more deeply concealed, is a trap simultaneous with the origin of the logical, that of viewing death from the perspective of God. God, a being, is conceived as thinking both being and its negation with unperturbed mastery, so that non-being is thought through the power of a supreme being, as being qualified by absolute impoverishment, and as the inferior pole of a bifurcation within being. Above all, non-being is simply to be thought, and the divine model of logical relatedness secures being in its privileges, adorning it in the robes of methodological presupposition. Death expresses the law, and thus subordinates itself to the highest being. The intellectual neutrality that is thus attributed to God in his comprehension of non-being is the real possibility of a thanatology, or logic of death. Pious annihilationists are committed not only to the possibility of thanatology, but to its effective existence in the divine intellect, as the absolute pinnacle of reason and justice. For them thanatology is architecturally fundamental to divine law. Such servile annihilation is an eliminative negativity, which can be thought of in two broad ways, either as a formal or as a speculative relation. Deconstruction is happy to accept it as either before displacing it. Formal elimination corresponds to a positivity understood as extraneous to its negative qualification, whilst speculative elimination, formalistically, misconceived, is the simultaneous inherence and non-inherence of such qualification to positivity. In both cases the content of such a negation is determined by that which is qualified by it, which is the precise definition of elimination. The Spinozistic principle that Hegel enthusiastically embraces as the speculative restlessness germinal in formal reasoning, omnis determinatio est negatio, means that a positivity is determined by its exact elimination, or, in the words attributed to Hegel in the Zusatz to his lesser logic, the foundation of all determinateness is negation. The indetermination can only be read as either the formal negation or the speculative development of determination if it is itself understood as eliminative, which is to say, determinate. Such a move is of course, when fully explicit, Hegelianism itself. Quite different is the indeterminate sense of indeterminate negation, which is not eliminative, but ferocious. Ferocious negation is radically heterogeneous in respect to the annihilation it effects. so that it is intrinsic to its definition that it cannot be derived from its eliminative consequences by either formal or speculative logic. Far from being topic neutral, logic is reasoning from the basis of secure existence, which is to say, in the absence of time. Hegel thinks history, but not time. The laws of identity, non-contradiction, or determinate negation attain their rigor only by qualifying itself with respect to metamorphosis, insisting upon the simultaneity of logical relations, or the absence of temporal differentiation, asynchronicity. Such a qualification is constitutive for ideality, whether in the weak, scientistic, or the strong, theological, sense. In other words, ideality is nothing other than logical obedience or pure being, and the topic of logic is ontology. It is unfortunate for the logicians that suicide is not a mere decision, but also a technical problem, exemplifying the irreducibly heterogeneous relation between the being and its potential for inexistence, which is never even remotely its own. Such a heterogeneity is attested more generally by the struggle for oblivion and the positivity of the sacrificial process. It is the ferocity of death that entangles it in eroticism. The sexual act is in time what the tiger is in space. Unlike a logical negation, death requires a complex occasion, intricate conjunctions, the interpenetration of bodies, turbulent flows. There are innumerable ways to die, but this proliferation of routes out of the maze does not lead to the simplicity of a general negative possibility. Ferocity is not reflectively determined through the exercise of a negation, indeed, it has no determination at all, but only a real composition generated in a violent collision of heterogeneous elements, whose issue is a complex synthesis. The various negativities consummated in complex syntheses have no logical equivalence, but only real consistency, or, in Bataille's terms, communairy. It is because the realization of expenditure requires the assemblage of a complex synthesis that there is a problem of consumption, finding its inevitable issue in an impossibility, in the sensation of dying or undeath, existence out of excess. Nature, far from being logical, is perhaps entirely the excess of itself, smear dash and flame upon zero, and zero is immense,